I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune, and I want to welcome you to this keynote conversation, one of 12 at the week-long 2021 Texas Tribune Festival. This is the 11th year our nonprofit news org has been convening the biggest names in politics and policy from across Texas and around the country to discuss the most pressing issues and the most interesting ideas of our day. At the Tribune, we believe events like this one are journalism, consistent with our public service mission to educate and engage our friends and neighbors. If you believe in that mission, if you believe that a more informed Texas is a better Texas, consider becoming a Texas Tribune member. Go to texastribune.org/join to give during our fall drive, when the first $50,000 in contributions will be generously matched by our friends at the Lowy Law Firm in Austin. Whether or not you're a member, we're excited to have you join us for our latest and greatest TribFest program, which features more than 190 speakers and more than 60 compelling interviews and panel discussions. I think you'll especially enjoy this session featuring U.S. Congressman Joaquin Castro, Democrat of San Antonio, former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and former San Antonio Mayor Julian Castro, and Jason Johnson, the host of the Slate podcast, A Word.
You are listening to A Word with me, Jason Johnson. This week, we recorded in partnership with the 2021 Texas Tribune Festival, a virtual experience from September 20th to the 25th that offered big thinking interviews and nuanced discussions on the topics you care about most. Learn more at tribfest.org. And today, we're talking about two influential Texans who are shaping the state's and the country's political future. Julian Castro served as the mayor of San Antonio and Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under the Obama administration. He ran for president in 2020 and is now a political analyst and host of Our America podcast. Joaquin Castro currently represents the 20th District of Texas in the U.S. Congress after many years as a state legislator. He currently serves on the Foreign Affairs, Education, and Labor committees in the House and leads the Texas Democratic Caucus. Julian and Joaquin Castro, welcome to the Texas Tribune Festival and welcome to A Word.
Hey, great to be with you, Jason.
Great to be with you, yeah.
Really excited about this. As you all may or may not know from Twitter and social media, I'm a big fan of both of you politically. So this is personally really exciting for me. So I have to start off officially. Happy birthday to both of you. You guys had a birthday this week.
Thank you.
You know, this is going to be airing a little bit later, but I have to ask you just on a basic level, what's it like celebrating your birthday now, probably your second one in the middle of a pandemic? Like, is it just a bunch of text messages? Do you get virtual Grubhub cakes from friends? What happened?
Well, you know,
you're right that usually, I mean, since we're in politics for years, I think from 2002 all the way up through 2019, with the exception of 1 year, we had a big bash every year, you know, both of us being in politics. And then the difference has been that during this pandemic in 2020, 2021, we didn't have that. And so it was a lot more low key, but still a lot of fun, you know, getting all the
hanging out with
family,
family,
Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff.
Okay, it's still nice. It's not a big old party, right? But you still feel pretty good. So this is the thing. I'm going to put this out to the public. You guys both turned 47, and that is still relatively young, right? In American politics.
In Congress it is, but yeah, I guess
exactly. At the federal level, it's still
age.
very young, given our last couple presidents and everything else like that. Going back to when you guys, you know, let's go back 30 years to when you guys were teenagers. Did you ever imagine that you would be where you are today, you know, before 50 years old? I know it was hard to imagine when you were in high school, but you know, Joaquin, I'll start with you. Did you think you'd be where you are today, you know, when you were 17 years old, by 47 years old being a member of Congress?
No, you know, I mean, we had an interest in grassroots politics because both of our parents were really involved when we were growing up. And we just grew up in that kind of household where policy and politics mattered. But I didn't necessarily think that I would be in Congress or have a specific role in mind about what I'd be doing. And it wasn't actually until, you know, 10 years later after that, that I decided to get into politics. And I'm now in my 19th year. I got elected in 2002 and took office in January of 2003. So yeah, so I spent 10 years in the state legislature and now in my 9th year in Congress. But didn't really have a specific office in mind back then.
And Julian?
Yeah, I mean, same here. I wouldn't have thought that. In fact, over the years when I had a chance to talk to high schoolers and middle schoolers, especially when I was mayor of San Antonio, I used to tell them, like, it's okay if you don't know exactly what you want to do when you're graduating from high school, right? A lot of times you feel that pressure. I don't think Joaquin or I knew or had a strong sense that we would be exactly where we're at. What we did know is that, like a lot of other folks, that we wanted to do well, we wanted to excel, and we're willing to work hard to excel. And we followed our passion. I think Joaquin knew it before I did, in terms of like going into the law, and then in college, both of us started to get this interest in actually running for office, and then we went from there. It's sort of the life's turns, and both expected and unexpected. And then all of a sudden you wake up and you're 47 and here you are, right?
It's funny, even when you think about when you're younger, the idea that one day you're going to wake up and say, oh, wait, I'm 47.
That's true.
The kids today are like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine I'll be that old. So, speaking of what you did and did not imagine, Julian, so you ran for president in 2020. You really, really championed issues like prisons and housing. And it's funny, in preparation for this, I was taking a look at when you came up with the Pause Act to talk about pets. And I remember like colleagues were like, oh my God, no one's ever thought about that before. So here we are, we're 8 months into the Biden administration. Where would you grade them on how they've addressed some of the things that you were passionate about when you were running in the primary last year?
Well, I give President Biden high marks on taking care of business. And by that, I mean, like when he entered, we had an economy that was still dragging very much. We had a pandemic that was raging and is still ongoing. He's done the things he most needed to do, which is to get shots in people's arms and to focus on making sure our economy is good. And he's also put a spotlight on a lot of changes that we need to make on immigration and a number of other issues. There is still important unfinished business, whether we're talking about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, or immigration reform that still needs to happen and hopefully will, in this, partially at least, in this reconciliation budget. So, I give the administration high marks for a lot of what they focused on and have accomplished. And there's a world of difference between what Biden is doing and what Trump did in terms of competence and everything else, heart and compassion and effectiveness. At the same time, I believe that we need to pursue a nation where everyone counts. Right. And the fact is that too many people are still being left out in America. And so this Congress and the president have still a lot of work to do to make sure that we get to an America where everyone counts.
So, Joaquin, you have a different perspective. You're actually in Congress. You've been through an interesting 8 months, from an insurrection to to storms and fires, and literally you had the entire Texas legislature of Democrats come to you guys like Princess Leia, help me, Joe Biden, you're my only hope, right? I mean, do you think the Biden administration is doing enough on things like pursuing the insurrectionists, or more specifically in Texas, doing something about voting rights? Do you think that there's enough urgency on the part of your colleagues all the way up to the administration?
I guess let me start with the first one, the January 6th insurrection. I, especially early on, right, as the FBI started investigating, they started arresting people. I thought that what they were doing was too light, actually. And they've expanded what they're doing, and they've also, they're sticking it to people more because of the severity and the gravity of what these people did.
Right.
But I think early on, I felt like it wasn't enough. I do feel like it's better and it's more extensive now. And now there's hundreds and hundreds of people that have been arrested, and there's still these ongoing cases. So in that sense, I think that it's gotten that the response has been more appropriate for what happened and for what the folks did, the insurrections. And I think not only was it an insurrection, it was an attempted coup.
Yes.
These people were trying to stop the United States Congress from basically accepting that Joe Biden is the next president. And so I'm glad that the response has stiffened. On voting rights, look, the president has made it clear that he supports what is HR1 and HR4. I do think that he's going to have to continue to really get in there and twist arms, so to speak. I don't know that we let go of the filibuster. Well, let me jump a little. Let me go back a little bit. I know there's a compromise now in the Senate that Joe Manchin has led. It's kind of the Joe Manchin version of a Voting Rights Act, and if they can get 10 Republican votes for that, that'll be amazing. But we know that's also going to be very tough,
right,
to make happen. So if they don't get those 10 votes, and I think they're going to give it a little bit of time to see if that's even possible. But I'm very skeptical, along with many others, that that's going to happen. And if it's going to be a matter of changing the filibuster to get voting rights done, that's where the president's really going to have to step in and use all of his powers of persuasion, LBJ style, right, from the 1960s, where he was able to work with Democratic senators and get them to go along with his agenda on civil rights, on voting rights, on Medicare, all of it. But it's going to be a real test for President Biden, I think, when we get to that moment, like probably shortly.
Yeah, I'll be honest. My greatest fear is similar to police reform, that a bill will get passed that'll have no teeth. And then, when it gets done, it's like, oh, hey, we did something, but it's like, it's not, fundamentally changing people's lives on the ground. Julian, speaking of changing lives on the ground, I always thought it was very key when we looked at what Governor Abbott has been doing in Texas, that they attacked voting rights first, they suppressed the vote, and then they went after abortion rights in order to almost make sure that they wouldn't face because if you went after abortion rights first, you may face consequences electorally, next year. What kinds of things are you hearing from advocates on the ground about abortion rights? What kinds of stories are you hearing? And I guess for a lot of us who aren't in Texas, we wonder about this. What are regular people in the street saying? I mean, this is a law that's been in existence for essentially, I think, almost all of our lives, that's just been thrown out the window by a legislature without a tremendous groundswell of support.
Well, they've tossed away 50 years of legal precedent, 50 years of a guaranteed right for a person to have an abortion. There's a lot of fear out there, whether we're talking about activists who, of course, are still resolved to push back and to claw back this law, or everyday people out there, that this right is being taken away and what that means for the ability of folks to control their own body. That is cause of a lot of fear. We hear companies now saying that they're having problems recruiting employees to Texas or keeping them in Texas. We hear companies saying that they're not going to consider relocating to Texas, even though they were before.
Right.
So not only is it causing a lot of fear, and it's affecting the ability of women to control their own bodies, it's also hurting the Texas economy.
Right.
And that's becoming more and more clear. You have a party in Texas and the Republicans that are living on borrowed time. They recognize that the state is changing. They recognize that what happened in Arizona and Georgia will happen in Texas if people vote, if people are able to fully exercise the franchise. And to get to your first point, that's why they're trying to suppress the vote, because they're trying to rig the system to keep themselves in power as long as they possibly can, even though their views truly do not represent a majority of people. And this SB 8, the abortion legislation, is going to have a backlash, going to cause a real backlash on them. That's what I hear out there.
Joaquin, same sort of question, but in a more targeted way. So Nissan, Amazon, some company that you're talking to try to negotiate to sort of bring to your district, to bring to Texas, they're calling you now saying, what the heck, right? We've got people who don't, we have people who want to leave now. We have people who don't want to transfer there. And, we saw this happen in Georgia, right? All those gun laws, and Brian Kemp had to back off of them because you had Hollywood itself was like, we're not going to come to Georgia. We're not going to film in Atlanta if you don't fix this stuff. What do you tell companies as a member of Congress now when they're like, hey, we don't know if we want to come anymore? Are you like, hey, we got a plan on the books, we think Joe Biden's going to do it? Or are you just kind of telling them, hold out? What are you saying when you're getting these phone calls?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, it's a combination of things. I mean, first, the federal response in trying to stop it, for stop SB8 from fully taking effect. That's one part. But really, part of it is a plea for, in the long term, for companies and people that have a different vision for the state's politics to actually stay in Texas and fight back and stand up to this and fight back. Because in a sense, these far right folks who have passed this law, they win if everybody that disagrees with it, or many people that disagree with it, stay away, or some of them leave. For them, that's a twofer, right? Because not only have they enacted their policies, but they've discouraged people from sticking around or from coming. That said, I think it's a reality that, we saw Salesforce recently that said it was willing to relocate any of its Texas folks who wanted to leave because of SB8. You ask Julian about what the average person thinks. I just think the average person thinks that it's overkill.
Right.
Even the idea that if somebody rapes you and you're going to be made to have that person's child, I think most people think that that's right-wing overkill. And for years, Republicans had courted big businesses to move from places like New York or California to relocate to Texas or put a second headquarters in Texas. Well, they're finding out that for these corporate business folks, they don't have much patience for these bathroom bills,
Right.
or attacking transgender athletes, or for overkill legislation on abortion. And Leon mentioned that their days politically are numbered when they can do this. I think that's right, and I think they've also, by attracting all these big businesses to Texas, have also contributed to changing the political climate in Texas.
Yeah, and it's not just Georgia. You saw the same thing happening in Kansas a couple years ago. It's like, we're going to do this whole ALEC. We're going to change Kansas into this, open, free, laissez-faire state, and they couldn't get executives anymore because that middle class educated family is like, we're not moving from Pittsburgh to Kansas where our kids can't get educated, where we can't get access to healthcare. You lose out on the kind of growth that you need. Julio, I want to go back to this because we talked about this when I had you on the podcast about a month or so ago. You talked about how COVID is also contributing to another crisis that we're facing, this housing crisis. People being out of work, people being evicted. Now you've got the Supreme Court getting rid of the eviction moratorium. Since that decision, what do you see happening in Texas as far as a sort of horrible frappe of homeless people and COVID? And I also want you to speak to this because this is something literally that I saw yesterday. Here in Los Angeles, there have been increasing efforts by the local government to literally mow down encampments of housing insecure people. I saw it yesterday. Just a whole community that was under a bridge, and they brought in backhoes and trucks and just tore everything down. Those people will now have no place to stay. Those people will be wandering around. Those people will be staying in people's backyards now. And those people won't be in a safe community when it comes to the spread of COVID. Can you talk a little bit about how that looks in Texas with COVID rates still rising and people not having places to stay and no eviction moratoriums?
Yeah, it's a perfect storm for misery.
Yeah.
Rising COVID rates, the lapsing of the eviction moratorium, also the cutoff of unemployment insurance. Now, the boost cutoff had happened for Texas some time ago, but many folks are losing their benefits overall. And so there are a lot of people either who have become homeless or living on the edge. Perhaps they're doubling up with a family member or friends or people living in their car. And we had a rental affordability in this crisis well before this pandemic. We already saw in places big and small that rents were skyrocketing, and they've started to do that again, especially because there's been this pent-up demand of some landlords who feel like they weren't able to do what they wanted to over the last year and a half with their property. And, come hell or high water, basically they're going to free up that unit and jack up the rent. That's happening in place after place, including in Texas. You don't have rent control in Texas. You don't have some of the guardrails that are in place in other places. Ultimately, the answer is that as a country, we need to get much more serious about truly investing in housing that's affordable to the middle class and the lower income people. There's a little bit of hope on the horizon. The reconciliation budget It included over $300 billion of investment in affordable housing. That would be the biggest investment that we've made in generations. So, you know, that's a long-term solution. In the meantime, states, including Texas, need to be as good as possible at enacting local or statewide eviction moratoriums where they can, and making sure that the rental assistance that Congress provided for, $47 billion, gets into the hands of renters and landlords that need it.
Joaquin, you know, that was one of the big issues that a lot of, I mean, what's upwards of $40 billion of the rental assistance hasn't even gotten to the people that need it yet. What's that like in your district? Like, how, you know, have you been able to get access to that money? Has it been difficult to get directly into people's pockets? What's it like as a member of Congress, knowing there's this huge money pot there, knowing that people are hurting, but having trouble getting it through the state apparatus?
Yeah, for the city of San Antonio, it's actually, we've been a bright spot in our ability to get a lot of
That is true.
out.
Yeah, they've in the city of San Antonio, they've done a good job.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, our mayor actually got recognized nationally for the program that they put into place to use some of those monies to help with rent and other things. And but that said, I mean, we get calls every week from folks who are worried about housing. And so, and from, I think, year to year in San Antonio, as one example, home prices have gone up 24%. You know, so yeah, I mean, people are just facing, whether it's on the rental side or in terms of buying their homes, they're facing a lot of challenges. And the slowness of a lot of places to get that money to people is hurting. And by the way, this is one example, but that happens with federal programs way too often, and other programs. And for example, in Texas, after some of the hurricanes, the federal money was dispersed very slowly to Texans. And it, you know, it makes you wonder, like, you appropriate all this money, but if you don't actually get it out to people, it's like you really didn't do anything, right? Like nothing happened because they're not getting it and there's no effect. And so that is actually a priority, is how you fix that pipeline of distribution for funds to get the money to people once the Congress appropriates it.
So you bring up something very interesting. We talk about the ice storm and whether, how that affected people and getting money to people when they were in trouble. You know, and in the African American community, up until say the last 10 or 15 years, right, there was this notion amongst a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people, that like, oh, the environment was a white people issue, right? That getting African American voters to care about the environment, to care about climate change. Now that's different. You have people talking about, you know, food deserts, and you have people in the Mississippi Delta who are like, hey, look, we're dealing with these storms. Where do you think environmental justice is? And I'll start with Joaquin, then I'll go to Julian. Where do you think environmental justice is as a priority in the Latino community now, especially in Texas? Is it something that people, is it now a top 5 issue? Are people still saying, hey, look, I don't really know? Where does it sort of fall? We'll start with Joaquin.
I think it's still emerging as an important issue. And I want to be clear here. I'm not saying it's not an important issue.
Right.
I think it's emerging because I think that the work has not been done to go into, in Texas at least, the Latino community, go into the Rio Grande Valley, go to the Gulf Coast, and really work with the communities that are affected by industrial pollution and energy pollution. And so when we focus on these industries, we often talk about the incredible economic opportunities and the jobs and how they sustain communities economically. And by the way, that's true. You've got a lot of families that depend on these industries for work, but we don't really talk about the fact that TCEQ, the state environmental regulatory agency, basically lets people get away with murder, so to speak, environmentally. I mean, really, they hardly fine anybody significantly for anything. I mean, industry is violating rules every single day and getting away with it. They're emitting stuff into the air every day and getting away with it. And the people that are paying the price often are African American and Latino communities in Texas. But I'm telling you, a lot of times people don't even realize it because nobody is connecting the dots for them. And, you know, they're living the sunny side of it, which is they're supporting their families from this work, which is obviously very important. But people are not also talking about what can be the harmful environmental impact to their kids, to other family members from what's going on.
My university is Morgan State University, where I'm faculty. We talk about these kinds of issues all the time, like the ridiculously high cancer rates for African Americans in Baltimore,
Right.
despite the fact that you've got Johns Hopkins there, and people for years didn't necessarily understand it, and now you're finally getting this sort of groundswell. Julian, sort of what's your perspective? You were out running around the country campaigning. When you talk to Latino communities, in South Carolina, in Iowa, they're there, in certain places, was this something that people were bringing up, or is it something that you're still, as your brother sort of mentioned, you still have to sort of enlighten people and educate people to how important it is?
But look, I mean, I agree with you that traditionally that issue of environmental justice and environmentalism has been seen as sort of an affluent white issue, so to speak. Mm-hmm. At the same time, the folks who have had to deal with the biggest environmental challenges, the biggest environmental problems, whether they're landfills or what we saw in Flint, can't drink clean water, or living near a Superfund site, and many of our public housing developments are within a mile of a Superfund site. We did some of that research when I was at HUD. Black and brown communities particularly, and Native American communities and low-income communities especially, bear the brunt of it. And what I see out there is a new generation of activists that are making that connection for the community. And I see a community that is more savvy out there to it. I mean, maybe they don't speak about it in the political terms that are tossed around on television or in the halls of Congress or in a political debate, but they talk about the experience of their child that has asthma or a condition that they have. And more, they're making that connection to corporate overreach and power and to the lack of investment in environmental safety. So I agree with Joaquin in that sense that it is emerging, that voice is getting stronger. And I believe here in Texas, you're going to see more and more folks get elected on the Democratic side, boldly taking on those issues, making that connection. Jessica Cisneros, who ran in Laredo in the 2020 cycle, was one example of that. Mm-hmm. I think you're going to see more.
So this is slightly lighter, but this is something I'm really passionate about. Joaquin, you did an op-ed in Variety talking about one of the reasons that we see such disconnects between the government and Latino community is the lack of effective and diverse representation of Latinos out of Hollywood. You mentioned statistics. You only have about 5% of Latinos that ever get speaking roles. Half the times they're criminals, they're monsters, or something else like that. And this is something that I'm very passionate about for all communities. It does strike me that, why have we not had the Latino Black Panther or Shang-Chi yet? The MCU is making all this money. So first, I want to sort of talk about this with both of you guys from a macro level, from a micro level. When it comes to programming, right? I mean, I see Elena of Avalon. I see anything Cristela Alonso does in Cars. How do you guys find programming that you think is a positive representation of Latino people for your children? I mean, has that been something difficult for you before we even sort of talk about the larger Hollywood issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they of course watch like Dora the Explorer movie and the cartoon and some of the children's shows, I think over the years have gotten better about presenting a more diverse cast of characters. So that's good, but my kids for years were watching the things that I think everybody, Paw Patrol and the different, Disney, Frozen and all the different Disney movies and so forth. So it's still a big challenge. And you're right, Jason, like when we talk about this, anytime you mention Hollywood, people kind of think that's fluffy, right? It's not a hard issue like a healthcare or immigration or Medicare for all or some issue like that. But I actually think that this issue is a foundational issue for many communities, including the Latino community, because Hollywood, although there are competitors now like social media, mostly because of disinformation, Hollywood is still in the United States the main image defining and narrative creating institution about groups of people. Mm-hmm. And so, I really started this work in earnest after what happened in El Paso, Texas in 2019,
Right.
where you had a guy that drove 10 hours and killed 23 people because he said he considered them, quote, Hispanic invaders to Texas. And I thought about, where does a guy like that, where does he get these ideas? And the more I looked at it and thought about it and researched it, the more I realized that you had this very dangerous overlap between the traditional stereotypes of Latinos that have come out of media over the years, from Hollywood, as lazy, as drug dealers, as illegal, and then the political world where you had people like Donald Trump and other politicians, even more now, that will abuse those stereotypes for their own political gain. And the reason that they're able to do that in large part is because the Latino narrative in the United States is missing.
Right.
There's a void there. And I remember last year I was on a Zoom call with a publisher of a top 5 publishing company in the country. And I asked him a really simple question. I asked him if he could name 3 Latinos or Latinas who had had a significant impact in American history. And the gentleman thought about it for a few seconds and he finally said, no, I can't.
Wow.
And these are like 3 historical figures of a guy that's a CEO of a textbook publishing company for schools. And so to me, what that means is that there's a void in narrative that Americans, I'm really convinced that Americans really don't know who Latinos are. And that void in narrative has become dangerous. And by the way, it's not just for the Latino community. It's been dangerous over the years for the African American community, especially the stereotyping. It's dangerous for the Muslim American community because over the years, especially after 9/11, too often when you see them on television or on film, they're cast as terrorists or as evil people.
Right.
The Asian American community, I think, has been going through some of that as well, particularly on the political end, because of all those hate crimes, because the president said that, called it all those different viruses and so forth. So there are many communities that are confronting this issue. And unless we change the institutions that create the images and drive the narrative, then people are going to continue to be profiled in a dangerous way.
And Julian, we'll want to get your thought on this too. I mean, look, yes, we've gone from Speedy Gonzalez to Elena of Avalon, right? My little cousins love Elena of Avalon, so that's we've had a little bit of progress here. But you as a Latino man who's now in media, who's now in podcasting, which again, it's you and Alicia Menendez and Jorge Ramos. There's still not a lot of Latino representation in media. How do you see that as also being sort of a problem in how issues of the Latino community are presented when so many are locked out, not just in Hollywood, but even in sort of media discussion?
Yeah, I mean, and Joaquin's been so eloquent as he was a moment ago on these issues that, who's shaping the narrative about a community matters. It matters that you're getting authentic experience and stories that are shaping that narrative. And everybody brings a perspective to their work. So when we talk about news media, for instance, it matters what kinds of stories somebody covers, the perspective that they bring to that coverage, the judgment that they bring, the spotlight that they put on people's stories that might not otherwise be put, or the nuance that they bring. And that's been mostly missing over the years for Latinas and Latinos in major American media, including, just take your pick. I mean, somebody did this great thread on Twitter the other day. I say great, really depressing, actually, on the lack of Black and brown editors and writers at major magazines. But you could say the same thing for cable news, or as Joaquin said, for Hollywood film, or now for these new digital media. That needs to change. And these companies need to step up and do a lot more, because you and I both know that there are a lot of people out there with the very same talent and ability of a lot of people that have been lifted up.
Yes.
It ain't a matter of people's talent and creativity and and ability. They have it. Black and brown folks, throughout this landscape, but they haven't been given the opportunity to shine. They haven't been mentored. They haven't been retained. They haven't been promoted in the way that they should. And that needs to change.
Well, first off, I want to thank you both for giving us the opportunity to let both of you guys shine. This has been a really fantastic conversation. I'm so glad that we got to discuss all these different topics. I hope everyone who is listening to this enjoys the rest of the Texas Tribune Festival. Joaquin Castro represents the 20th District of Texas in Congress, and former HUD Secretary Julian Castro is a political analyst and the host of the Our America podcast. Thank you so much for joining us on A Word today.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Take care.